All right, welcome everybody to the third webinar with Map the System Canada 2025. Map the System Canada is sponsored by ATCO and is in partnership with the Institute for Community Prosperity and the Skoll Centre at the University of Oxford. My name is Ashley Dion, and I am the program lead for Map the System Canada. Map the System Canada is housed at Mount Royal University. Royal University acknowledges the relationships to land and all beings and the songs, stories, and teachings of the Siksika Nation, the Piikani Nation, the Kainai Nation, the Ithka Stoney Nakoda Nation, and the people of the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Métis. If you want to stay updated on all things Map the System Canada and build connections with other systems thinkers, connect with us on LinkedIn and Instagram. Shortly, I will put the link into the chat. And today's webinar is about crafting compelling system stories, and our guest is Dr. Catherine McGowan. So join me in thanking Catherine for being here today. Let's get started. Over to you, Catherine.
Ashley, and I will share my screen now as hopefully smoothly as possible. So thank you so much for Map the System for inviting me to come to talk about telling compelling system stories. Just a bit of a framing. So I am a historian by training and I work in a business school. So a lot of what I do is kind of in the liminal spaces between disciplines and between spaces. And in such, I have a class where we sort of directly connect storytelling and systems thinking, which is probably why Ashley asked me to talk to you guys today. I will say that this presentation is not in any way sort of definitive. It's meant to help you start thinking about how to form compelling stories. So, all right, let me see if I can, there we go. So just a quick sort of framing. Generally speaking, when we talk about telling system stories, we're really looking at three often deeply overarching goals. So the first one is to help your audience go from seeing sort of the individual parts of a system, which where they may be more connected with, to appreciating that interconnected and stuckness, and appreciating sort of why it is that the system is proving so challenging to shift. The second and possibly most common one is to shift people from thinking about individual crises, which may be evident, and understanding long-term trends and patterns that are sort of contributing to chronic issues in the system itself. And the third one, which I think is more aspirational sometimes than achieved, but still very important to mention, is the idea of helping people see meaningful and realistic opportunities for change in a challenging and complex environment. And you'll notice that each of these, spelling issues aside, have an idea of a journey, of sort of going to someplace or taking people with you. And so I want you to pay attention to that as we go forward. So this is not in any way sort of this idea of kind of just an information dump, but that there is an expectation with a lot of system storytelling that there is a personal transformation either by the storyteller and or the audience. So one of the big problems that you guys face is the question of how do you actually do this? It's such a silly question, but it's really important. So one of my favorite novels is Pride and Prejudice. Not a huge surprise. I'm a white woman in Canada, and I was 16 once. And there's actually a sort of an element of Pride and Prejudice that has shown up in economics and other forms of systems change. And that is this idea that sort of really deeply changing people's values takes time. So for those of you unfamiliar with the plot of Pride and Prejudice, which would be a bit of a surprise, we have two characters who come together at the beginning and dislike each other significantly. And over the course of the novel, they come into contact in different contexts. They have a chance to see each other sort of respond to crisis. And at the end, they fall madly in love and everything is wonderful. But the key is that idea of the Pride and Prejudice effect of sort of that initial idea we have, the initial sort of set of values and actions that are often tightly coupled together, take that kind of time to shift. And that I just like in the novel, sort of that's multiple points of contact and multiple opportunities of seeing different sort of elements of a particular relationship can help with that change. But you don't have that. So the question is, how do you sort of adjust for the conditions and parameters under which you are functioning in Map the System? So this is something I cannot emphasize enough. In terms of telling a good system story and telling an effective system story, getting Lizzie and Mr. Darcy together, it's not about just having the best facts. In my class, we probably spend about 2 to 3 weeks just dispelling this notion that if you simply have the best information, you will be able to convince people, change their minds even about what you're talking about. And it's a real conundrum because you guys have now spent potentially several years diving deeply into your research topic, and you're deeply, deeply passionate about it. And so to tell you it's just not about the research is kind of destabilizing. There's a couple of things, though, that you can start to sort of bring into your planning that I think will be very helpful. And then we'll sort of dive deeply into each of these over the course of the next hour. So the first one is, you've done all of this research and you will not be able to communicate all of that in 10 minutes. You need to figure out a way to communicate complexity clearly. And I have a couple of tactics and techniques I think you can try, but I want to sort of highlight that as one of your first steps. So how do you take all of this research and figure out a way to identify the key dynamics and elements that you want to communicate and be okay with leaving the rest of it behind? The second piece, especially if we're thinking about those 3 goals of system storytelling, really has to do with your interaction and your relationship with the audience. So you are going to be facing strong status quo bias, even among an audience who believes in you and is cheering for you. You may actually also be facing sort of some preferences that are differently aligned from your own, and possibly some values that are going to sort of inform a different perspective on the system and may lead to some potential disconnect between yourself and your audience. And lastly, even if you have an audience that's deeply, deeply passionate about what you're talking about and sees your passion and cares about it the way you do, realistically, we are all very busy. And you are likely going to want to have a call to action embedded in your presentation, because I doubt that you've spent this much time engaged in this and sort of walked away like, meh, I guess it's kind of interesting. So the question is, how do you get them to care about this one more thing in an environment that is always asking for their attention, that's always asking for them to care, and that essentially is putting too many burdens on their cognitive load as of currently, and you're now adding another one. So those would be sort of the 3 things we dive deeply into. So that first 2, communicating complexity clearly and engaging with your audience. Let's take a moment. When we talk about storytelling, we often focus a lot on the story and a little bit on the storyteller. But realistically, we actually need to be thinking about 3 things simultaneously that interact to create a good story. So the first one is the story itself. So what are you actually going to be presenting? And with this, you want to think about it almost as an offering to your audience. So what of all of that research are you going to be pulling out and offering to them as a gift or a boon from the journey that you have gone on? In particular, you do want to think about, when you form your story, how do you build congruence? So the congruence is the alignment of what you're saying and what they believe to be true. And fundamentally, a lot of this comes down to one of the most important decisions you can possibly make in this stage of your map system preparation. What is your most important thing? So you have 3,000 words in your paper. You've probably got multiple maps. You've put a lot of effort into that. And I am now going to ask you to figure out what your most important thing is. And that's actually quite challenging. Realistically, we know that most people simply don't pay a lot of attention, even to the best presentations, and likely, even when they do pay attention, are not going to be remembering very much. I'm the mother of a toddler, so Bluey is my universe right now, and I've been using sort of a GIF from Bluey with my students of the father bandit saying, "Kids switch off if you speak too long." And it's true at any level. So what you really want to do when you look at your research is think about sort of what is that one thing, and it should really be a sentence even, that you hope that you feel necessary that they remember. Once you determine what your most important thing is, you can then create a bit of a filter around all of that complex research and identify those things that are helpful to understand, underscore, and support the most important thing. And those should be in your presentation. And the things that are fun facts or cool things that you've discovered, or even interesting, but let's say different sort of rabbit holes, those you have to learn to be okay to walk away from. So once you determine what your most important thing is, then you can use that as a spine and a filter for sort of building up an effective story. Now, there are 2 other critical elements, however, of storytelling. So who is actually the storyteller? Interestingly enough, we often sort of, again, this is where the best facts come in. We know from research that anyone, any listener, if they trust either the key sort of narrator in the story or the key sort of figure in the story, they're more likely to therefore trust the journey that that person goes on. So, how are you as a storyteller being credible with your audience? In some cases, we see this taking the form of positionality, so talking about your experience and who you are. But in other cases, it can be a little bit more subtle. So, ways of building credibility can actually be about how you frame your story. So, using common story structures that people recognize can be quite helpful. Using language that associates with basic emotions and experiences. And I mean basic. So, we're talking about things like what honey smells like when it's warm, or cookies out of the oven, right? Something to think about. Chances are on this call, very few of us have run a marathon, but it's likely that most of us have at some point in time had sore muscles. So if I am trying to sort of connect using sort of that kind of visceral or sensory language with my audience, I'm not going to say, remember the last time you ran a marathon, but I might say, do you remember that last time you worked out too hard? Or do you remember that last time that you really pulled a muscle? And so more likely to be a sort of common experience, and that kind of sensory language that is more common is a better way to sort of gain credibility and sort of connection with your audience. And that leads us to the third pillar, the audience themselves. So you first of all should never assume that your audience is actually an audience. When you are telling system stories, even in a space like a Map the System final, that we often presuppose that because they're all physically there at the same time, they are a coherent whole. But that's simply not true. They have often come because someone is presenting, or maybe they can become a friend of theirs, friend is presenting, or in our case, perhaps we mentioned that there was going to be free coffee and snacks, and students are hungry. And so you really need to think about how you both unite them as an audience and how you will actually sort of get them to care about your issue. So the story itself, sort of how are you building a story that is logical around the most important thing, the storyteller and their credibility, and the audience's openness and union around you are sort of three key interlapping elements that sort of inform whether or not your audience is willing to walk with you in this journey down your systems analysis. One important thing with Unite is that and it says this on the slides, but I think I need to emphasize this. Simply talking louder or faster or more passionately is not enough. So it's not enough if you're traveling in a foreign country to get yourself understood, and it's certainly not enough in this kind of space. So you really you want to think about, why are they here? Sort of what can be something that that brings them together, and how can that connect both my story and my credibility as a storyteller to their interest. If we were to map their brains, we would actually be able to see whether or not you were succeeding or not. So there's a concept called neural alignment, where essentially if I am listening to you and we speak the same language, that parts of our brain will be sort of lit up, the language section. If I understand what you're saying, then an additional part of my brain will light up. But if I agree with your interpretation of events, then our brain scans will essentially look almost identical. And that's kind of the goal here, is neural alignment. And we can do that by sort of combining the art and science of the story, the storyteller, and the audience, thinking about how we structure our story, what is the content of our story, how do we present that story, and how do we think about sort of building that connection from beginning to end in the story itself. So I want to talk a moment about congruence. So this idea of sort of how aligned is the story with your audience, because I think it inherently in the space that we're in, this is actually a little bit difficult. So if I am speaking to a group of students and it's like the 5th or 10th lecture, I likely have a pretty good sense of who they are and what their preferences are. And they've also probably signed up for the class and now they're stuck and they have to stay there. And so determining sort of congruence is relatively easy. I know who they are. I might have read some of their assignments. I know what their politics are. But with the kinds of research that you guys and your students have been doing, a lot of it is actually about challenging those assumptions. And so inherently, congruence is something they're going to have to build. They can't sort of dive down old ruts of doing and thinking and being. So we can think about congruence or fit between the audience's beliefs and the story, not necessarily just in terms of the conclusions. That's not really going to help us, but more in terms of the structure. So first of all, we can rely on sort of established language imagery and story structure that people may be familiar with. So we're going to really hit on the story structure in a moment, but we want to think about sort of what might be some common, especially images that could connect our story with our audience. So again, I use the example of running a marathon versus having a sore muscle. Very few people have run a marathon. Most people have pulled a muscle. Similarly, we can think about this idea of not necessarily everyone's baked a complex cake, but everyone sort of has a sense of what fresh cookies smell like out of the oven. And so we can think about sort of what are some of the basic level imagery that may be able to introduce our audience to the visceral experience of something in our system. So let's say you have someone who's talking about the difficulty of navigating the healthcare system. Not everyone has had, let's say, complex mental health issues, but most of us have waited for a doctor and have been kind of frustrated. So that could be a helpful image. Thinking about that kind of really basic level that could help make a connection with people. Like I said, we'll return to storytelling and a story structure in a moment, but it can be helpful to use existing story structures that are contextually bounded in the space that you're in. I say contextually bounded because, in Western society, we are heavily informed by things like the hero's journey and a lot of sort of European storytelling. But if I was in a different cultural context, I would want to learn what some of their sort of foundational stories were before making an assumption about how to use story structure. So again, if I'm talking to an audience of students who have gone through the Canadian educational system, I'm pretty sure that they've encountered the hero's journey. If not in class, at least in Marvel. But you do want to know the context of your audience when you're making those choices. Where I think people are more anticipating this conversation going is this concept of spiciness and emotions. So chances are your students are going to be talking about something that is inherently sort of politically charged. And it can be a bit of a minefield when it comes to sort of speaking to an audience and uniting an audience, especially if that audience has not sort of already opted into their particular political beliefs. You need to, generally speaking, with this kind of thing, it's okay to have challenging perspectives. In fact, we would encourage students to have data-based challenging perspectives. But we want to be aware when we start forming our story if we are going to be challenging the values and beliefs of the people in the room, because it does place us at a little bit of a sort of a challenge, if you will, and it makes those kind of common images all the more important. So we want to acknowledge the fact that it's likely the topic we're looking at is going to be spicy. Spicy is the term I often use in classes to refer to something that is politically sort of charged, partially because if I call it complex, that actually turns a lot of students off. So if you are very passionate about sort of a particular political issue, you may not see it as complex. You may see it as morally very clear. And the word complex feels wishy-washy. But we found that spiciness, everyone sort of agrees that yes, that those things are spicy. So when I use spicy, that's what I'm talking about. So it would be helpful if you had a sense of where your audience beliefs are, and if you're planning on challenging them, so that you can be very thoughtful in the imagery that you use to unite them and in the story journey that you go on, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, chances are whatever you've been doing also has a fair degree of emotional weight to it, especially if it is politically charged. And we do know that if your emotional sort of read on the story as the storyteller aligns with your audience's emotional read on it, that increases the likelihood of congruence and of neural alignment. However, if there is a misalignment between sort of your emotional read and your audience emotional read, particularly if your read is negative, that is very off-putting for your audience, which is kind of counterintuitive to how we often think about these things. We're like, no, I'm so mad about this, and I want you to care about it. It's like the movie Network, which immediately dated me to half the audience doesn't even know what I'm talking about. And students sort of want to be outraged about this. They're angry, they're upset, they've just spent this time. So when I tell them that positive emotions work better to connect with an audience than negative ones, I get a fair amount of immediate pushback. And it's not that you can't be outraged, but what's helpful when you're building your story is to think about how you can identify spaces and places where positive emotions can be helpful to bring your audience in. And that's sort of that's kind of critical for this next little bit that we're going to be talking about. You'll notice here I mentioned hero and truth and trust. We're going to come back to that in a moment. So I'm just going to, cognizant of time, this is going to sort of highlight that we will be talking about heroes in a moment, but I want to spend a bit of time on spiciness and emotion. So I created a bit of a thought experiment for my class around congruence, emotion, and that kind of sensory language. Now, we don't have enough time to do an exercise here, but I want to encourage everyone to use the chat. I created these 4 different scenarios where the storyteller and the story does not align necessarily with the values or the perceived values of the audience. And I had my students sort of say, what could be an effective image to start your presentation with that is going to sort of bring people in, that's going to sort of acknowledge whatever is common in the room, and potentially get them to care about something that feels adjacent to their perspective. So I want to encourage anyone, if they have any ideas, to pop an idea in the chat. I'm going to walk through 2 of them, and I'll give you the example that I gave for one and the example my students gave for the other. And I'm going to start with the student one because I was really impressed by this. So I gave one group of students scenario 3, the idea that you're talking to a largely sedentary population about the scandals in elite sport training. I said, how do you get them to see this as their issue? So this is probably not something that is potentially politically spicy to this group. This group, a largely sedentary, non-active group, may not sort of identify elite sports as part of their politics or not part of their politics, but it's going to be as separate from their personal experience. And so the group sort of spent some time and they thought about it, and they sort of identified this idea of, you've worked really hard on something, it's a project, and you're passionate about your project, and you want to show it to someone, and you present it to them, and they step in and say, well, I could do it better. And they say, well, you're not really doing a good job. I'm going to do it for you. And then they ruined it. And this idea of sort of having something you'd worked hard towards, and then having someone step in at the last minute and sort of destroy it for you. And they said, this is what it's like to be training and then have someone come in and dope and win the gold medal. And I really like that because they actually used it in terms of like baking an amazing sort of cake for a birthday, and how much work you would have put into it and how proud you were. And then someone coming in with a store-bought cake and saying like, oh, well, I made this too myself. And so it's taking credit where it didn't belong, instead of identifying a lot of the tension around what it would be like to be an athlete. And I found that to be honest, it worked quite well with the group. They also had a lot of like gross language thrown in about this idea of like, you've put so much time and effort, and what if there's a hair in this store-bought cake? And that grossed everybody out. But of course, that was a common experience. People know sort of how unpleasant it is to find hair in food. It's a little bit adjacent, but I did give them 5 minutes, so I was quite impressed by that. The example I want to highlight here is scenario 1. So you're talking to a group of patriotic Canadians, and you want to teach them about Africville. How do you find emotional common ground? So I gave this to some of my students, to be honest, some of my very, very competent students, and they were completely flummoxed. And they sort of, the big thing that they had difficulty here was finding a positive emotion, because they had interpreted what I meant there as sort of saying there's something good about the raising of Africville. And so we had a great conversation. And what I said to them is that it's not about sort of finding positive in the negative. It's about building to something positive. And I used an example that I often use in my teaching when we talk about complex issues like this. And that is that my grandmother was a refugee from Eastern Europe. And she got citizenship the same year that one of the elders I work with went to residential school. And that there are some people who only want to tell her story because it makes us feel good. This is what we know about Canada, right? It's welcoming, it's engaging, it protected her. And we like that, right? And yet it's the same thing that happened the same year. And so it's not about saying her story is better or the elder story is better, but it's acknowledging the fact that that is both happened in our history, and how do we build a history where that doesn't happen again? And that is something I think a patriotic Canadian can care about. And that idea, sort of saying, you care about this country, so do we. And that's where we think we can move in this better direction. And so it can be helpful sometimes really thinking through, especially if you know the politics of your audience are different from the conclusions you're taking in, how are you going to actually unite them? How are you going to find common ground with them? And how might you draw them along an interesting story that they will at least be willing to trust you on? Which leads me to my next slide. There we go. Realistically, to be honest, most of the time you're probably going to be dealing with apathy, not spiciness, but we can sort of think about both as potentially our enemies in building effective change-making stories. And a lot of this does come down to the idea of what are we trying to do? And if we're trying to get people to care, if we're trying to get people to see interconnection, if we're trying to get people to understand how the system functions and ideally maybe make change, we need to be prepared for both spiciness and apathy in your audience. And we need to sort of build a story that will make it as easy as possible for your audience, angry at you or apathetic, to come alongside. So ultimately, a lot of this comes down to the system itself, from my perspective. So we know that systems essentially are experienced, that all the analysis your students have done, or you have done if you're a student, really is about trying to understand some element of the human experience. We talk about the idea of surprise or emergence in the system as being a critical thing we're trying to understand with systems thinking. And fundamentally, though, surprise is experienced. It is something that we go through, that we understand on a personal level. And so, given that, and given that we know that people identify much more strongly with human stories than they do with data alone, how can we use that to help us sort of drive along, overcome apathy, deal with spiciness, and hopefully sort of build an effective story? Well, I'm going to present you with one set of tools with two possible sort of avenues. You're not obviously required to do this, but I have personally found, especially the first one, quite helpful for students who are just into this process and who might have discovered something that challenged their personal values and beliefs in the course of their research. And that is to think about the hero's journey. So this slide immediately dates me as a child of the 80s, because of course these are all Harrison Ford, but they do sort of indicate some important elements here of how I think about the hero's journey as it relates to telling a good system story. So none of these are perfect heroes. None of them are essentially people who are, I mean, I guess maybe this one, maybe clear and present danger. I'm not sure. It depends on how your politics are. Nowadays, I think this is much more popular than it might have been a few years ago. But ultimately, what you want to be able to do, and what you can potentially do with a hero-based story, is to connect your research with some element of the human experience, and to acknowledge the way that a person has experienced either the system itself or the process of understanding the system. And in so doing, you can actually give your audience, your MIT, your most important thing, as the boon in the hero's journey itself, that thing they can take away as a key lesson and possibly a call to action. As a reminder, for those of you who haven't spent a huge amount of time engaged in the hero's journey, this of course comes from Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Faces from 1949, so super current. And it is problematic. There are some issues with how Campbell characterized this. It's very heteronormative and focused on men, which of course is, we know there can be heroes who don't fit gender preferences and who are all different types of expressions, and as they should be. But there are kind of three elements that I think are helpful to pull out or to emphasize. So the first one is this idea of the separation. So at the beginning of the hero's journey, the hero is often sort of embedded in their village. This is usually a call and response in my class. I'll sort of say, okay, so tell me about a movie that you think fits this. And we'll sort of go through the movie as it goes. This time it was Thor, because Thor works quite well. But we've also done Moana. But this idea of sort of the heroes in their village or in their context, and something happens that sort of essentially calls them to leave. And in the case of a lot of movies, they can actually be kicked out. In some cases, there's a crisis that sort of triggers them to leave. But for us, it is often a growing awareness of a systems problem. that sort of pushes us out of our existing context and sort of forces us to leave what is comfortable and start asking uncomfortable questions. So the hero then leaves their context and they go on a journey. Usually that journey has a series of sort of challenges associated with it. And in the case of Campbell, sort of there's often a team around that. Sometimes it involves a temptress. As I said, it's a very 1949 sort of take on it. I instead included Princess Leia, who of course I think is a perfectly formed hero and does not need to have any challenges. But the idea is that we will encounter people on this journey who will challenge us and offer us help. And that actually happens for a lot of our students. They may have interviewed someone who is an expert in the field, and that would be sort of like Obi-Wan Kenobi, sort of offering guidance. They may have encountered a really impressive social entrepreneur who is challenging the way we do things, Princess Leia. And that through these sort of challenges, these trials and victories, they are able to both better understand themselves and better understand the problem in which they are engaged, which then leads them to the return where they come back to their initial context with a boon or some sort of learning. So this can be sort of ethereal, like a better sense of self, and it can be an actual physical sort of boon, like in Moana, where she sort of restores the heart of Te Fiti. In the case of our students, this is often the thing they've learned about the system, their MIT. And in theory, that MIT can be simply reflective, so I now better understand. But usually it also has some sort of call to action embedded in it. So it's a boon that has both what have I learned and how do I think we can change things. If you can't tell, sort of, I really genuinely believe that there's a really great way for students to use the hero's journey to talk about their own journey through the system, which I'll get to in a moment. But I do want to say, and I want to say this very clearly, this is not about perfect. And I think that's why students are fantastic for it. Realistically, a strong hero story is not about sort of a perfect person emerging fully formed and sort of succeeding completely. Even in Campbell's telling, all of the most, if not all of the heroes have deep flaws. And those flaws are either sort of learned about and improved upon through the story or are overcome through that ragtag team of people. Ideally, a hero story should really be about sort of exposing the paradoxes and tensions that people live in. So why is this person a hero? What about what they're bringing? What about the context that they're interacting with is making them a hero? Can be a really helpful way to talk about some of the basic tensions of the systems in which we function. We are not talking about people who have solved everything. So we're trying to avoid the risks of heropreneurship. If told well, a hero story is not about an individual sort of pushing against the tide, but instead is usually about someone bringing many people along with them, either through their own personal learning and journey or by the boon that they can give back that will then benefit their community far beyond their own actions. Ideally, these hero stories should be cohesive. They should bring people together and offer people a way to see their own flaws as things that are if not fixable, at least not fatal. So the idea of, how can we use the story of a systems hero, for lack of a better word, as a way to talk about how it's like to actually live in the system, but a way to talk about what it's like to actually survive and be resilient in that system. Nice thing is, heroes are not fixed in time. We pick our heroes based on the context in which we're functioning. The only sort of there are examples of stories that sort of mutate over time but stay with us, something like Robin Hood, for instance. But even those are contextually bounded and shift based on the time and place in which they're being told. So when it comes to picking a hero in our story, we need to think about what the context of our audience and of ourselves, so to be able to identify individuals, whether specific or otherwise, that can be helpful in helping people see the system as a whole. Ultimately, I have seen this done very well one of two ways. So the first one is to actually have the student or students be the hero themselves. This works really beautifully because they have gone through this journey. They got the call. In some cases, they saw the ad from Map the System. But in other cases, there's something that they've been thinking about and worried about for a while, and this was an opportunity. This was the call to leave, if you will. They have gone out. They have collected information. They have learned things. They have been challenged. In some cases, those challenges may be fundamental Their values may have changed. In other cases, they may have just been time constraints, but those are real challenges. And they have, in theory, learned something that they want to share. The nice thing about using yourself as a hero is that you're wonderfully flawed, so no one hopefully will accuse you of heropreneurship. But two, you can bring your audience alongside your journey of revelation so that if you are challenging their values and beliefs, you can show how you came to that challenge. So potentially even imagine them like your original context, you're coming back with your boon and you're explaining how you started where they are and how you have moved. When done well, this kind of thing can essentially make your audience feel like they are participants in your research, which gives you greater credibility. It tends to help you build trust with your audience because you're being transparent in how you came to these ideas. Ultimately, there's a whole sort of set of conventions around this, but they're not really that much more complicated than the call to action, sort of the actual journey itself, and then the outcome or boon that you have learned. If this is appealing to you and you would like to dive more deeply into it, there's a wonderful link. The Story Collider is a nonprofit that works with scientists to help them communicate the results of their research more accessibly. And they actually have a podcast, and they'll essentially use the hero's journey or modifications on the hero's journey to help the scientists frame their research in a way that is hopefully going to draw people in rather than turn them off. And that's kind of, to be honest, that's one of the great benefits of this, is that you can be quite transparent with challenges that you faced as a researcher, with your own sort of emotional or value shift that happened and where that came from. But you also are speaking of yourself, which gets us back to the idea of congruence. If you are speaking from your own experience of your own journey, then it's much harder for people to dismiss you because you are you. You know, you're not sort of claiming, I've done all this amazing research, trust me, it's there, some sort of appeal to authority. You're instead saying, let me walk you through what I saw. And that is it does tend to build congruence more quickly than does someone relying on excellently sourced statistics presented in a very sort of dry and two-dimensional way. However, not everyone is deeply comfortable with this approach. So there are other ways to sort of find similarly valuable heroes in your system. And that can be going back to your system itself and identifying some key systems dynamics that you can put a human face on. So whether it is identifying sort of specific individuals in your system, or whether it is actually sort of creating ideal types and identifying their journey through the system, which can make a great additional systems map. It's a journey. So one of the sort of ways that especially if your students have done a lot of research and they have, especially primary source research, they may sort of start to identify ideal types. So common journeys through the system. And this, they could turn into potentially stories of how three is probably good for 10 minutes. So people have experienced a journey through the system. Where have they had sort of these hit common obstacles? Have they been stuck in particularly pernicious balancing loops? Have they survived a challenging sort of process? And how does that survival tell people about what it's like to live in this system? The other option is to identify there is someone in the hallway, which is shocking on a Friday at Mount Royal. The other option is to identify, and this is probably the greatest risk of heropreneurship, really interesting social entrepreneurs who have themselves gone through a bit of a journey, have experienced sort of a challenge, and have now learned something about it. The risk there is several fold. So the first one is heropreneurship, sort of celebrating a hero rather than understanding the vagaries of things. The second one is, where did this come from? So if the students have done interviews, then that can be a sort of a more credible place. But if they're simply talking about someone that they say is sort of powerful in the system, who is different from who the audience expects and perhaps not well grounded, or not, the audience doesn't understand where it comes from, that could lead to a lack of congruence. Fundamentally, what we want to do when you're finding a hero in your story is you want to ensure that sort of you're not talking about a superhero, but you're talking about a human who has, again, experienced the paradoxes of being alive, and that connects to that most important thing. So what are they learning? What are they giving back? And ideally, if you pick well, you're essentially your audience will trust your story more if they trust the storyteller or if they trust the main character. And if you are the main character, then you are essentially doing double duty, but potentially also being quite beneficial. So students talking about what they have personally learned can be a really effective way to build that trust, and show your audience the truth of something messy and difficult. Additionally, too, the idea of using the hero's journey helps students build towards potentially something that has that positive emotion that aligns with their MIT, because you're giving them a boon. You're giving them some sort of learning, and that learning can therefore turn into a call to action. So by combining those, you can build to a positive emotion. So the Canadians who want to make Canada the kind that welcomes refugees and not the kind that has residential schools, that building would be part of your boom. So that idea that you're going towards the MIT, that is something that they can use to go forward and potentially contribute to meaningful change. So my boon to you, to me, the three things that you really want to think about when it comes to building your story, independent if you decide to go the hero route or not, is first, what is your most important thing? So you really need to come back to this as much as possible. It should be sort of something that you revisit consistently to ensure that you have something tight, right? I'm not talking about an elevator pitch, but I'm talking about sort of, imagine that your audience is going to listen to you for 10 minutes and only remember 1% of what you say. What is that 1% going to be if you have any control over it? And once you figure that out, that then becomes sort of your both the spine of your argument, but also the way that you determine what is the critical complexity needed to support that MIT, and what are the kind of complex issues that I have to let go. You know, for anyone who's ever defended a dissertation or done a lecture, you know that 80 minutes, an hour, 3 hours is still insufficient to communicate all the complexity of any particular issue. 10 minutes is challenging. So the idea of actually only having one MIT over 10 minutes should in theory be freeing, because in that way, ideally, you're not trying to pack more stuff in. You're saying, what is necessary for this MIT to be communicated and understood, and what can I let go of? You'll always have to let go of stuff. And if you have it, great. That way, if you go forward in the competition and someone says, I really didn't understand something about your MIT, can you explain it? You've got it back there. You got it in your data set. It's still there, right? But you only have 10 minutes, so you should only be trying to convey ideally one thing. One complex thing, one messy thing, one thing. Number two, who is your audience? Are you speaking to people whose values are sort of shared by you, and therefore you can dive more deeply into some of the vagaries? Or are you dealing with an audience who may be apathetic to what you're presenting? So you're going to have to do a little bit more to explain why this MIT is important, or potentially who may be hostile. It's not impossible to connect with them. And we need to get rid of this idea that the best storytelling is the thing that convinces everybody, because unfortunately that's just not realistic. But we can think about how we reach out to people whose values may be different from ours, so that they can start to see either why this issue matters or why this perspective on the issue should not be disregarded. Ultimately, who your audience is will help you decide which emotions, story constructs, and images you can bring in. I often sort of, with my students, and this may be helpful for you guys with your students, is to ask them about someone in their life who they respect, but who doesn't sort of know much about this issue. Their mom, that's an awful one, your mom, that thing, or your dad, older siblings, and say, like, imagine you're talking to them. And actually, if you can, talk to them and try to figure out how you can connect with them on this issue. Do not talk to people who already agree with you, but find that person who you respect, who's going to give you good faith audience, but who is not necessarily embedded in this, and who you can figure out what those best tactics are to reach with them. In my class, we actually did a focus group on this, and it ended up being really revelatory, because most of the students had had presupposed a level of awareness of their issue that simply was not present, even though the students have been together for 13 weeks. And so that chance to sort of workshop this, I think, is really critical. And if you have time, I would strongly recommend that you sort of have your students figure this out and explore what connects with different audiences so that they can identify something that will unite their audience as an audience and have them wanting to go on this journey with your students as storytellers. And lastly, who are you? What makes you credible? It's not necessarily the best facts. It can be how much research you've done, but it's not necessarily just sort of repeating statistics. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be how embedded you are in the problem, but you do need to sort of make a case about how you are credible to communicate this MIT and how you can build that credibility with the audience, build that trust with the audience through things like uniting them, through things like effective story constructs, so that that MIT will be communicated and will be remembered. As I said, 1% of what your audience hears they will remember. Let's make sure it's that 1% that the students are passionate about and that will fundamentally improve this country. All right. I did not think that would take 46 minutes, but I am happy to stop and take any questions that people may have.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
You talked about the power of positive emotion. The hero's
Mhm.
journey. I mean, there's research that has mapped the change of emotion over the journey, right?
Yep.
There's curiosity, there's fear, there's arrogance, there's the fall, there's shame, there's redemption, and then
Yep.
in the best stories, there's a happy ending, right? There's this it's a redemption story. The hero's life
Yes,
is a redemption
exactly.
story.
Yeah.
So then there's I've fallen, I'm a fallen hero, but then I'm somehow
I have redeemed myself and I've given something back to my community.
I've redeemed
Yeah.
myself and I've given something back to my community. So that's interesting, because it's like you said, the range of emotions, but it's also kind of ambivalent emotions, a mix of positive and negative. And you said it's got to be a positive emotion that you redeem yourself and you give it back to your community. And together you create this sense of kind of unity of purpose and shared experience through the journey. So it's kind of where you want to end is positive emotion, I guess, is my question. You might actually start with like a frustration or an anger, but it's I think ambivalence in and of itself can be quite powerful because it's a mix. Yeah.
So here's where I'm going to come more as someone who's taught this for a long time. I would stick to 3. I would start with curiosity. Yeah, curiosity. If the student can have difficulty, like challenge, like get frustrated, definitely. And then if not positive, like when I say positive emotions, I mean, yeah, the research just simply suggests that if you go in negative, if you go in angry and your audience doesn't agree with you necessarily, you've turned them off. Right.
Yeah.
And that's just something we don't want. So I think if at the very least, if you're not sort of at the end, like, yay, everything's good, at least that idea of I've learned something and now I want to share it, that kind of redemptive element would be sort of, I think, a good way to end it. What I would strongly recommend is to keep it as simple as possible with the students. And I think especially sticking to those 3. Really, to be honest, what you almost want to do is to map it against Dunning-Kruger.
Okay.
The idea of sort of I'm starting, like, especially assuming your audience is starting at Dunning-Kruger and your storyteller is just a little ahead of them. And the idea of sort of, we've gotten past the trough of, oh shit, sorry, I guess this is being, or whatever. We've gotten past the trough of, oh shit, I actually don't know anything. And we're back now to somewhere where it's like, I have enough confidence to want to know more, or I have enough confidence to at least think that this is something I care about. Yeah. Okay. Just 10 minutes is what you don't want to do with this is to be pitchy. To be like let me tell you how we're going to solve all these things in 5 minutes or less. And it's from experience, from seeing and participating in a lot of these, that sort of the idea of the curiosity, the challenge, and to be transparent with the challenge if the student feels confident is a fantastic way to sort of build audience credibility, because the audience may be also frustrated. The audience may be also especially if you are being very sort of transparent with some of the issues that you find, that kind of reflecting back on them will be critical. And then sort of ending with that kind of redemptive loop of, if not simply I have learned more and therefore are more wise, but also this idea of there are things that we could potentially be doing that is the next step for us to think about.
Okay.
But keep in mind, they have 10 minutes.
I know.
So the more you can rely, the reason that I sort of have been sort of, I used to have all of like a bunch of different ones. And I sort of, the reason I've sort of hit on the hero's journey to return to is it is so common that people will follow the rhythm of the story without realizing it.
Mm.
So they will start paying more attention to the content than to the specifics itself. If you want to get complicated and start having something like mapping it over, let's say Lear, you may have lost half of your audience right there. But the hero's journey, chances are they've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it's like I said, it's more about, we want to help them. We as educators need to help them be okay with not sharing everything they've done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I still remember what my PhD advisor told me. He's like, you're going to present 25% of what your research has been.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like 25%, that's it. He said 75%, maybe that's publications later, right? But it's communicating that to students in this space is challenging, especially for our undergraduate and our college level students who are still in an environment where assignments are usually quite tightly drawn. The parameters are very clear, and we've just taken them away. So that's why I would sort of, spend a bit of time having them think about how they can map it across existing story frames, because they'll be more familiar with them. They'll likely take them for granted, and therefore will focus more on how they can use it to their benefit.
Okay, yeah, good. Can you talk a bit about the role of images?
Sure. I mean, okay. So because we're no longer competing for the top 3 to go to Oxford, and it's just all Canadians all the way down, or my goal is that it'll be all turtles all the way down, if you know what I mean. So I mean, obviously their systems map have to be part of their presentation unambiguously. That is,
Map,
it's
plural,
critical,
right?
How they talk about it, how they engage with it. Unfortunately, I will be honest, in my personal experience, again, being with this competition for, Ashley reminded me, a decade. Thanks, Ashley, for that one. Visuals I really haven't seen. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this well. So having a visual style is critical. Having a sort of a kind of a consistent sort of theme or motif through your presentation will be helpful. That can actually just be colors. Like it can just be like my theme is red, right? And it's helpful too if that overlaps with your story. So if your theme is pink, but your story is about male, I have a concept in my head. I didn't just start the sentence. Male body image issues at the gym, that there's a discongruence there. But in terms of building congruence, if you can have your images align with sort of the narrative that you're telling, you potentially will push things along. In terms of shock imagery, that has to be handled very carefully. So it can be a way to sort of bring your audience in, but it can also turn them off immediately. And it's like things like female genital mutilation, actually seeing sort of residential school graves, those kinds of things are immediate turnoffs to people. They communicate a lot of emotion in the picture itself, and often a normative assumption in sort of the image assumption, in the image choice. And unless that is consistent and sort of acknowledged, it can really sort of potentially run you afoul. But having a motif that runs through is critical. If using your systems maps, try to encourage your students to pull out the MIT in that as well. So let's say you have a really beautiful map that's got like tons of beautiful, amazing feedback loops, like just gorgeous. Like you look at it, you're like, I want to eat that up. If your MIT is one piece of that, have the students, don't pretend the map doesn't exist, but then have them focus the attention and even the screen on the sort of that core relationship. So have those visuals align with the MIT, and also therefore help them if they have too many images to sort of think, okay, what doesn't sort of help me in this sort of this choice.
Yeah.
In the past, we've had some presentations where students are so committed to showing off how much work they've done that they're doing the visual equivalent of speaking as fast as possible, and that's not going to connect. The one I'm still hopeful that will be done well, and I haven't personally been able to see it, but maybe I'll be wrong this year, is the use of video.
Mhm.
So the idea of having, let's say, interviewees being videoed, or PSAs that are directly relevant to the issue. In theory, it should work, but for some reason, there just seems to be, you lose the sort of narrative flow of the presentation, and it ends up being quite jarring. And I mean, that could have just been everything up until now. It just hasn't worked, and there's an amazing one to come. But in theory, with congruence, you should be able to touch all the emotions. So it shouldn't just be what you say. You should be able to use music. You should be able to use physical activity. You should be able to use sort of visuals. The question is, by adding those extra layers of complexity, are you making it harder for the students?
Okay, that's fair.
So
So, besides presentation, have you looked at this, like these rhetorical moves in the reports themselves, like the analysis?
So I face that question all the time on a personal level. So students are always like, should I have like a hero in my thing? And my answer usually to them, especially if this is the first time they're doing it, is no, just write me a report.
Okay.
Like, but as an immediate contradiction to myself, especially if they're using like ideal types in their presentation and they have a journey map, that is actually a really helpful thing, and it can show off their research in an effective way. So I don't know that they have to be. My concern is that there's a lot of decisions they have to make right now, and I think reducing their cognitive load is helpful. If,
Okay.
however, once you have your student success, you want to embed storytelling elements into the report to make it more fluent, then that would be excellent. Fluency in data presentation strongly helps a reader both understand but tend to also agree with how the final product is made.
Okay.
Sorry, I to put it differently, that will help the judges at Oxford be like, holy crow, your students wrote this awesome thing. And that can be done a couple of ways. So, I mean, an introduction can be a great way to bring it in. It's already a bit embedded in the report itself with the lessons learned. That's one of the reasons why I like using the students themselves, because they're making them think about those lessons learned a bit more critically than just like, we learned that this is an important issue. It's like, shouldn't that have been your a priori like assumption? So some of it's already embedded in there, but ways to potentially go about that, if you have a method section, to be very transparent in your methodology. And then if you have the space in terms of word count, would be to embed boxes of people's stories. So what is it like for someone to physically experience this? Students have done this very well with using quotations of people who are personally experiencing the system and embedding those into the report itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a way that we can like PDF tables and things so it doesn't count towards our word count?
Talk to Ashley about that one. You can put it in an image. If you put it in an image, if you had like little floating quotes around the systems map or around the iceberg, to be like, someone's like, well, this would be too perfect by half, but let's say they did an interview and someone said, oh man, the reward system here is just fundamentally killing us and making it, that's one in the iceberg.
Yeah.
There are certainly crafty ways to get around it. Ultimately, it eventually will get caught. I will say, like, if you're putting too many images, eventually we're going to be like, okay, well, we need to have a conversation about that. Because it is about doing good work, but it's also about, holding integrity and being fair. Right? So
Yeah.
that's
If I
also
was,
incredibly
yeah,
important to part of it. And that's actually a huge, huge part of Map the System Canada itself, is we are looking for humility. We are looking for humans within this system itself. So yes, I was like, there are some crafty ways to get around some stuff, but I also very much so, believe in students being honest and, understanding where those limits are and respecting those as well.
Yeah.
That's,
Fair.
yeah, if they're stuck, Leanne, I would have them put that in the presentation. It's more going to
Okay.
connect with people that way.
Yeah.
Look, I'm a historian, so, and even though I still teach in a business school, fundamentally, for me, systems are experienced. They are human experiences. And there's something really, we talk about how a system is greater than the sum of its parts. The human experience is often how we catch that greaterness. And so to me, this all comes back to why are we doing this? And we're doing it for each other. And
Yeah.
so this is how I lecture. Ashley can tell you that many years ago, is through story. And those ones tend to stick more effectively than the ones that go through. Stories stick better. And so
Great.
how can your students tell a good story?
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Catherine, for coming in and giving us some things to think about. And also, I think bringing the human aspect into it, sometimes we lose that when we're researching things at times. So it's always great to, at the end of the competition, to ground it back into being human beings and being part of society. So thank you so much for that. And thank you
Yeah,
to
our
everyone
students
who
have
joined.
they've done so much awesome work. So let's figure out how to celebrate them. And I
Awesome.
look forward to seeing everybody in Banff.
Yes,
Thank you so
me
much.
too.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
This is wonderful.